Thank you everybody for joining. I'm CJ. So CJ Hurd, Senior Vice President of Compass IT Compliance. I've been with Compass for over 5 years now, which sounds crazy. And kind of how I got there and what put me in front of you is I retired when the Compass came calling. They convinced me to retire as I was active duty in the Coast Guard for over 21 years. For the last 18 of that, I was doing cybersecurity at the DC level and really all over the Coast Guard, all over the country. So that puts me at over 23 years of experience, and I guess officially makes me old. I've got an 18-year-old now, so that officially adds to me being old. Coming back to my time in the Coast Guard, assessing vendors, wasn't something that was on my radar, something that we were doing. Anybody who's worked for the government, there's a higher level process for that. There's years and years and years of contracting. So coming over to do this with Compass and doing it at the private sector, a little different, right? A little bit of a learning curve, and understanding what we're looking for and what the process looks like. Like I said, Compass, we have a program for our vendors. And for us, CISO, with what we do this for a lot of different companies. So we act as a fractional CISO for, I don't have a number, many companies across the country. All four corners we stretch across. And part of that program is, again, I'd like to call it enterprise risk management. As you'll see there at the top. Where does vendor management fall under, right? It falls under enterprise risk management. And as you see, I'm not really a big slide reader. So as you look at our agenda, a lot of things that we're going to touch on, again, a lot of it all rolls up to enterprise risk management. And if Nick didn't mention, I think he did mention, if you guys weren't here yet, questions at any time. I love to answer questions as we go. Give me a chance to take a drink of water, stop listening to myself talk for a little bit. So if you have a question, let me know at any time. But as we see, we roll up to enterprise risk management. So you start thinking about where vendor management falls and what we're doing with it. It's part of that risk process, right? So we see strategic risk, cyber risk, compliance management, business resiliency, audit and findings management, financial part. Everything rolls up. So when I talk about protect the organization, we really want to make sure that anything we find from a risk standpoint is going to make it to the top of the company, right? We have a top-down strategy when it comes to anything risk related and trying to protect the company. So we identify, we assess, prepare, looking for loss, impact to operations. It all rolls up to the top. So same thing goes for vendor risk. When we're doing these, back to the other slide. So when we're doing these vendor assessments, and you find any type of risk, we want to document that risk and make sure we bring it all the way up to the top. So with that mindset, I had this funny slide when I give some of these presentations about protecting the organization and how do we protect the CEO, somebody at that top level of the company, right? They're ultimately responsible for anything that we're going to have from risk and how we report and notify clients and customers and whatnot. So those critical vendors are going to fall into this category. So when we start looking at what a critical vendor is, a vendor or supplier that's critical to the delivery or execution of your company's services, right? They go down, you go down. You can't deliver your services if this vendor goes down. So really important part of doing this is identifying those vendors, engaging the entire business, right? Don't just keep these things in a silo, keep them in a vacuum. Take a guess at who these critical vendors are. Engage the business units, engage the entire organization. We do a lot of things from a security standpoint. Your business impact analysis is another huge piece of this. In most of these cases, with all the companies that we work with, that's already done. So refer to that business impact analysis to see what those critical vendors are. How long can we go without them? What are our RTOs? What are our RPOs, right? Really bring that under the umbrella of identifying what these critical vendors are, who they are.
Quick question, CJ. We have a rapid fire, nice and early question. As you talk about engaging all business units, quick question, any recommendations on how to bring these risks to management? That was one of the questions posed.
Yeah, no, it's a great question. And there's a lot of different ways. One of the ways I like to do it is making the entire company part of the process. So a risk committee, right? You get a risk committee. you pull different people from different parts of the business, and you tie them back to this risk committee where we can start reporting and talking about what these risks are, and what is truly a risk and what needs to go to the top, right? So you bring the business units in, usually that's an executive level from a lot of these different departments. We discuss it. It's been identified. Where was this identified? By an employee, from an audit, from something else. And then we want to bring that up, whether it's I like to do it through a form. I like to have something that they can sign, something that if we're going to bring it up, we don't want to keep these risks at that low level. We've got to make sure it comes up. It gets, and by getting to the top that way, they acknowledge that risk. They accept that risk, right? They put in strategy to help us get funding to mitigate that risk, to remediate that risk, or maybe we can transfer that risk. We don't want to ignore that risk. So by having this committee, having a form, having something that goes up where you have that those talking points with the executive leadership, that's going to allow us to get that risk approved or whatever the decision is going to be. So again, risk committee, some kind of form, part of that process where it goes all the way up to the top. And it's at the very least acknowledged, right? I used to say in the military, you don't want to be the highest ranking guy with the secret, right? Make sure we report that up, let them make the decision whether it's a valid concern or not, or accept that risk. Again, why would we accept a risk? Well, it's very expensive to remediate that risk, right? We're not going to spend the money. Maybe what would happen to us because that risk was exploited, the cost would outweigh what that loss would be. So again, allow them, give them a chance to make the decision, and don't hold on to that risk.
A short kind of follow-up question / comment that I have here is, it says, not only RPO and RTO, but also SDO, on service delivery, ?
So on service delivery. So again, a lot of that would be going back to engaging the business unit. So a lot of what I'm talking about in terms of a critical vendor is something that's operating continuously or daily. Maybe you have something that's going to come every other day, and that's a critical part. And if they go down for more than 24 hours, so if you can tie what that SDO is back to what your recovery time or your recovery point is going to be, again, going to make a big impact for you.
Perfect. Thank you.
So, and again, and who are these important to, and what are they important for? Again, a little picture, but I think it says a lot. Is it important to the entire organization? Is it important to a certain business unit, a certain department of the company? Where does it fit in? And that really helps us when we're identifying what's critical and what's not, right? I really focus in that first pass at those critical vendors and that are critical to the delivery of our services. So we talked about critical vendors. What's the difference between a critical and a high risk vendor, right? So that critical vendor we've covered probably ad nauseum already. We're talking about that, to the service delivery. Now the high risk vendor, right? Maybe not a critical vendor in terms of critical to our services, but they're on that critical spectrum because they're increased risk to our company. They have direct access to our customers. They access our company systems. They have access to sensitive information, customer or employee data. So they've got a higher level of access than your average vendor. Maybe we control their access. Maybe we allow them to control their access, right? Again, probably not one of my favorite situations would be. I'm a big fan of having that control, but each use case is different. So we've got to go through that evaluation to make sure we've identified what kind of access they have, what makes them higher risk, right? You have the critical, you have service delivery, but then you have the access and the damage they can cause with that access to that customer data or to our systems. So big difference. And we treat a lot of these the same. High risk vendor will get a lot of the same treatment that we consider a critical vendor. With having that access compared to that service delivery. I treat them the same in most cases. Cause grave danger to us in different ways, I guess, would be the best way to say. All right, so let's go a little bit more in depth and do with what I consider, how we would go about our assessments. So there's so many different approaches here, right? And we all come from different backgrounds. We all work with different companies, and that allows for differing approaches. Money is I guess a huge part of everything, and certainly a huge part of this. So we can have our security reviews, our vendor reviews managed by a third party. To give a couple names, CyberGRX, popular, OneTrust, Wistic is one that I've used. There's a ton of them out there, and I've had a ton of calls with a lot of them. And great process of them managing it for you. It's not cheap, and a lot of times when they manage it, they have a different level. You actually had to review them as well, because a lot of times they have access to your systems, to your customers. They'll be contacting your customers on your behalf. But it's a nice way of transferring that responsibility kind of off of yourself, right? They're going to be the ones that have to ask you some questions, understand your posture, understand where you are from a maturity standpoint, and they're going to go assess these vendors in line with a lot of these security standards that we're going to go over. A lot of times you're sending a SIG-Lite, which is a form of questionnaire. They're sending a KEG, another type of questionnaire. These things are huge. I think the KEG has, in the 200s for questions, and SIGs, depending on whether you get a full SIG or a light SIG, you have upwards of 400 something questions, sometimes even more on the full SIG. So a lot of questions, right? So what type of vendor is getting that questionnaire? And sometimes, right or wrong, they get annoyed by it, right? The amount of time they have to spend on filling a questionnaire like that out, a lot of times it's going to be relative to how much you're paying them, what type of service it's going to be. If you're paying them, a small amount on an annual basis, are they going to go spend the 12 to 20 hours to fill out your big questionnaire? It might be a tough sell. So, and you see that a lot more at the larger size companies. I think average price I've seen is about $500 per questionnaire that they send out on your behalf and work through. So again, can be very expensive.
I have another question.
Yeah, go ahead, Nick.
So this question says, high risk is also those suppliers possibly related to sanctions, ? For example, Russian suppliers may have become high risk in context to Ukraine situation, ?
Yeah, honestly, yes, great point. High risk for different reasons. And that certainly can be one of them. Think about when you look at high risk, and you start thinking about regulations and legal ramifications and companies with sanctions on them. A lot of times we have contractual obligations in our contracts and in our DPAs and agreements with customers that we won't work with companies, that are sanctioned, or certain parts of the world. So absolutely, again, high risk there, but a lot of times that's a no-go, right? So once you identify that they have those issues, that ends up being, a high risk vendor supplier doesn't mean they have poor security controls necessarily. It just means they're high risk because of the access they have and the criticality to your organization. If they're in a sanctioned country, or we have contractual obligations that says we can't work with companies like that, that ends up being part of the security review and the outcome that, hey, we can't work with these guys because of X, Y, and Z. So really, really great question. I hope that answered it.
Yeah, I think so. I think that was a good answer.
So a lot of these, when you look at being managed by a third party, they're going to do a lot of this work for you. That next level is going to be, well, we're not going to have them do it for us, but we might have our questionnaire. We have a questionnaire that we're going to send out, and we have a large company that we did that last year, and even then we got about a 50% send back rate, which really it may have been lower than that. So it didn't go great. But they have a lot of vendors. We're talking couple hundred vendors and suppliers that they're having to meet with. So one of the ways that we've had some success is doing a Zoom meeting or a Teams meeting or whatever your flavor is to kick it off, have them understand where you're coming from. And a lot of that depends on the size of the vendor and size of the contract, of course. But taking a nice little friendly approach, here's where we're coming from. Here's why we have to do this, right? And the larger the company, the more mature the company, the more requirements that are out there. Here's why we have to do this. And we're going to give you these questions. Maybe we can answer a couple of them over the phone now. We can properly scope, how they do things and where data may be stored, get some answers that way. And maybe there's a couple different types of questionnaires that you can send out based on the type of access they'd have, the criticality, of course, but what you get out of that Zoom meeting. I find that goes a long way of meeting face to face, as best as we can sometimes, and having that conversation. So, third-party attestation, again, falls under, the do your own due diligence part, and is a good segue to where I'm going with this. A lot of times on that call, you can ask, hey, have you been through a risk assessment or an audit this year? Is that something that you can send over that we can take a look at? Who completed it? What was the framework? Was it a NIST? Was it an ISO? Do you have a SOC 2? What do you have that we can potentially review? And maybe that eliminates the need for the questionnaire. Again, no right or wrong way of going about it. It's going to be what's going to work best for you. But again, the key here is making sure that they meet the standards set by your company, right? You've got policy, you've got procedure, you've got contractual obligations, obligations to your customers, investors, partners. So we got to make sure we do our due diligence. So not necessarily a right or a wrong way to do it, but we have to do what the proper level of diligence is for your company. So my segue to what about the little guys? I mentioned in there, we work with a lot of small and medium-sized companies. A lot of you on this work for a small and medium-sized company, and using a third party, a large third party to help do our vendor management, probably isn't in the cards. So now when doing it for your own company, right? We're lucky enough to do it for many companies, so we get a lot of practice at it. When you're doing it for your company, and somebody's not answering your questionnaire, right? Well, we're a little guy. They're not going to answer our questionnaire. What do I do? Right. Well, you still got to do your diligence, right? We got to keep putting one foot in front of the other and move forward. And again, go back to protecting the organization, protecting our customers. I'm going to repeat these things over and over and over. But our contractual obligations, legal requirements, all these things that we do as a business, we have to do our diligence to make sure that we comply with that.
CJ, I got a good question kind of along those lines that was just posed. It says, we have a long-standing vendor that we have worked well with over the years, but as we have begun to address our vendor risks, we are finding that they are severely lacking in cybersecurity controls and appear unwilling to address the risks on their end. How do you typically approach these situations?
Yeah, great question. Unfortunately, a common problem. And I'll kind of give you backgrounds of how I'm going to approach it, because we come into companies that maybe we're new to them, but this vendor's been there, and this vendor's been there for a long time. And they're not complying. They're not maturing the way in 2023 we need to from a security standpoint. And I truly believe that the maturity of your security program aligns with the maturity of your business and operations. And where we are today, this landscape, it's hard to not have a security program and still maintain business. And this vendor, it fits into that category. So the first thing that I do is I evaluate alternatives. Right before I've had a conversation, I evaluate alternatives. What are the alternatives that we could turn to? What's the cost? Is there any kind of degradation in service? Does it still meet our customer, especially if it's a critical vendor? Excuse me, especially as a critical vendor. Where do they fit in with your maturity? If it's too low, we have that conversation. We have that conversation in person. But by doing our diligence and finding alternatives, companies that we could turn to, then I think that puts you in a better position to have that conversation and give you some leverage, right? They want your money. They want your business. They want your brand name. They have to meet some of those requirements, and you can phase it, right? Help them build out a project plan, point them to me, point them to us. We can help them build out a program. But again, identify alternatives first, and then speak with the business, tell them your concerns, get their buy-in, get their support, and you go meet with them together and bring it that way. If it's just you, it may not go it may be harder, right? I think getting that executive senior leadership involved will really help put that pressure on them. Hope that answered.
Thank you, CJ.
So talked about doing our own diligence. So SOC reports, SOC 2, Type 2, has really become the industry standard. Again, I've been in the private sector for 5.5 years now, and have reviewed, it's got to be 1,000 SOC 2s. I've helped companies go through the SOC 2 Type 1 and then Type 2. We design programs so that they can move to that operating effectiveness that's in a SOC 2, so that they have these security controls that align with the objectives, do a great job of marketing what they do have to show the maturity of their security program and of their organization. And that's what a SOC 2 does. And again, it's also allowed me, with my familiarity with it, it's allowed myself and my team to properly review SOC reports in line with doing your own diligence. And it's not just to look at a SOC report and say, oh, they've got a qualified opinion or an unqualified opinion. And in this case, if you're not familiar with SOC, qualified, while it sounds like it should be a good thing, it's actually a bad thing. So you want to have an unqualified opinion. So we don't want to just look to say, hey, do they have that one word that we're looking for, or not? That's our pass fail. No, we want to go a little bit more in depth to actually read into the controls that they have. Yes, it takes more time, but that's doing proper diligence. And I'll go a little bit more in depth on that. But other things with that SOC report is the observation period. Generally, you have a 6-month or a 1 year. You can have a 3-month, but it's kind of a short period. Is there a gap in observation time? Or is it consistent as they go year to year to year? That's what we're looking for. If there's not, I want to ask the question why. Again, going through the different controls, and you'll see some of the criteria that I go through and our guys go through. So we can go through that. But again, it's a lot more than just looking at that cover page, seeing who did it, when it was done, and whether it was pass or fail. Third-party audit reports. Sometimes I like these better. Truthfully, there's a standard framework. It's where SOC, you get to write your own controls, which sometimes can skirt around an objective. It's not quite as black and white as a third-party audit report. And when I'm talking third-party audit report, I'm talking about a NIST, CSF, maybe even bigger, CMS, an ISO 27001. I'm talking those types those are static frameworks, static controls, and you're either doing it to meet the objective, to meet the framework, or you're not. So, being able to see that report, they should be done annually, but seeing that they are doing it, seeing what findings they have, what the remediation plan might be. Again, a lot of it goes a long way. Again, I'm going to go back to that Zoom call. Setting the stage, letting them know you, trust you, like you, understand where you're coming from. It's much easier to get these reports when you take that approach. Pen test reports. So again, another thing that people should be doing annually, as well as if any major changes take place. So every company you work with that may have a network, or if they have a web application, they should be pen testing it. And if you're going to be accessing it, if you're going to be storing data in there, you care about the findings. Now, I'm not opposed to findings. I'll review a pen test, and I try to tell the executives that we work with these different companies, findings aren't bad, right? If you're getting a true good pen test, you want them to dig far enough, deep enough to find something. I care about what do you do when something's found. Do you remediate it? Do you remediate it in accordance with your policy, right? Are criticals getting remediated in 30 days, highs in 30 days? What are you doing with mediums and lows? Did you rescan, right? So if I'm working with a company that I work with, if you do a pen test, I say sign up for a retest as well. Because if we have potential retest, if we get a pen test with a lot of findings, I want to be able to remediate those, but I want to be able to get a rescan so we can show a nice clean test. I'm not opposed to showing both. I'm not opposed to showing that they had findings, that we remediated, and that now we have a clean test. That's a company I want to work with, right? They care about security. They're doing with the proper steps to remediate, and then retest to validate that it's all been fixed. So that's what I want to see. So I'm not opposed to seeing findings. I care about what happens when you have those findings. Security pages. These have become something that I look for, and some companies have them, some companies don't. And we're doing this a lot with clients that we work with. is we're building a security page that's public facing on their website and showcases what they do, what they have. Sometimes there's a 3, 4, 5, 6 pages long, and can really be a good marketing tool. And if you can find a company that you're going to be working with that has this, can answer a lot of the questions for you. They can point you in that direction. A lot of times companies will want you to look at this first before you send a questionnaire or ask them any questions. So these security pages can be a very valuable tool to learn about what a company does and what they have. Falls into the publicly available information. Google is a great due diligence tool. Has there been a breach? Has there been an incident? What can I learn? What are other people's reviews of them, right? I don't necessarily, pay too much attention to a whole lot of negative, because people will post negative, but I care if I see something that's security related, that might show a lack of maturity, might increase the risk, or raise real security concerns that I need to then bring up to management or to the department that's looking for this vendor, especially if they're critical. So I'm going to review that publicly available information. Again, Google's a great diligence tool.
CJ, before we move on to the privacy policy, I have a quick question for you.
Yeah.
Question says, appreciate the static CMS ISO 27001 audits. They are snapshots and one contribution to assurance. What other types of activity for continuous monitoring / assurance? One is pen testing that was mentioned. What about others? The security page on the website, etc.
Yeah, security page on the website can be, I like to date things, right? So it shows that it's been updated. I'm not looking at something that's 6 years old, something that's up. And again, privacy policy, same thing. I like to see that my privacy policy, whoever I'm reviewing, it's been updated. It's been updated recently. But again, those point in time reports, again, are huge. If you look at a security page, when has it been dated? Going back to the privacy policy, terms and conditions, as we talked about, other reviews. If they're willing to show vulnerability scanning, again, sometimes that's where reviewing, getting a copy of their policies. A lot of documentation that you think about that you have for your security program, or that you're doing as part of any audit, can you request? It's going to be what are they willing to share with you? So again, where those third-party audit reports, SOC reports are nice, is they are being done, on the annual. Maybe they've got a couple that they can show you to show progress and where things are going. But again, for me, those are the main ones that, whether I'm sharing externally, people asking us for questionnaires, or that I'm requesting, those are the main ones that give me as much up-to-date information as possible. That they're usually willing to share. Internal scan reports, I've been hard pressed. I won't share them, because understanding vulnerability management and vulnerability scanning, that sometimes there's a lot more to it, in terms of patching and exceptions and whatnot. But based on those are the three that the big ones for me.
And another question actually just came in, so thank you for that answer. This question says, how reasonable is it to ask vendors to inform a client constantly about vulnerabilities found in the system?
I struggle with this one, honestly, because we're going to find there's vulnerabilities all the time. Now, if we're doing our annual, let me phrase it this way: regular vulnerability scanning of my endpoints, usually of my network. And again, I've got other ways that I'll talk about how I gather some of this information. But their internal scans, again, I don't like to share mine, because they're a point in time. It changes minute by minute. I can look at a scan report from yesterday, and today it's changed, especially if we've remediated and you haven't done a rescan yet. So I don't share those, and for that reason, I don't usually request them. The pen test should be done annually, and you should be able to see as I talked about before, you should be able to see what updates. If you're doing your annual diligence like you're supposed to, you'll see that information. Critical vendors, you can take down to doing every 6 months, right? You can inform them that we do diligence every 6 months. So we're going to ask for your pen test every 6 months, or do something in the contract that says you'll share the pen test report with them when it comes up. And most companies are willing to do that. The other side, and there's a couple places where I'll talk about this as well. There's tools that you can get public facing scans. We're product agnostic, so nothing that we necessarily recommend or don't recommend, but a security scorecard, a black kite, companies that will do that public facing profile scanning of what they have, and you can see where they're doing well and where they're not doing well. And if their public facing looks like that, and you say it's really poor, then it's a concern that you can bring up to them, and you can get that information on their own. But for them reporting regular vulnerabilities, it's nice. You can ask for it. If they're willing to do it, then great. But I put more stock in asking for the pen test when it's done, and then those public facing scans. Hope that helps.
It does. Thank you very much, CJ.
So touched on privacy policy and then terms and conditions. Privacy policy. What kind of information are they collecting? What are they sharing? What are they selling? Does it align with again, back to the contractual obligations that you have? A lot of that's going to be in terms of GDPR, CCPA, and the other privacy laws that are popping up all the time. So again, where does that sit, and is that aligned with your policy, with what you're comfortable with what you're promising in your contracts and agreements with your customers? And then their terms and conditions. Again, another good review. DPA falls in here as well. And reviewing that DPA. And funny story is, probably a good time to talk about this. So I had a company we worked with, and they have a company that they were looking to use. And we did our diligence. I requested their SOC 2. I signed the NDA. We reviewed it, and they had a qualified opinion, which is a bad opinion. So went through, reviewed all the exceptions, saw their management responses, scheduled a call with them, reviewed it with them. They had made a lot of changes. They accepted the findings, which again, I see some positive in. They made changes, and we would see that those changes show up as being, no finding on the next report, but you got to wait the year to get it. So we were fine. We approved them, but we're going to review them at the time of their next SOC report so we can make these adjustments. So we passed them. They onboarded with this company, no problems. Move on. So I work with another company, and they have an existing relationship with the same company. And I brought up, what I had, I've reviewed them in the past, shared the information that I had learned from them. Fast forwarded a couple months, and we learned, looking at one of the contracts that they had sent out, because they're up for renewal, that they did not disclose that they store the data in Canada. Now, when we did the DPA in the past and they signed it, it was never mentioned they store data in Canada. Our contracts, our agreements state that we store data only in the United States. So similar to the question that we had earlier, we have an issue with this vendor. How are we going to fix it? We've got thousands of customers that we would have to notify if we were changing something to store data in Canada. So we worked with the client, worked with the vendor, and we got them to move the data to the United States. So it was consistent with our policy, with our procedures, and with our contracts and agreements that we have out there. So similar to the question that came up earlier, when you find something, take it head on, approach it. Work with your leadership, work with the department heads, the business units, and find a way forward. And we had an alternative lined up if they weren't going to work out. But fortunately, they did work out. But we did our diligence, and it really paid off. So now, I talked earlier about when I review a SOC report, and we're doing that deeper dive, that little bit more diligence. We're not just looking for a pass or fail or what the dates of the audit were. We're going a little bit deeper. So these categories you're going to see in the larger font. These are those higher level, deeper dive categories where we're looking to say, what controls do they have? Remember, SOC 2 is write your own controls to meet objectives. It's not as black and white as some of these audits that we see. So you don't have to be doing background checks to go through a SOC report. I look for it. Are you doing background checks? Are you signing confidentiality agreements, NDAs, right? So that they come across your data, they're legally obligated to not share it, to keep it. They know what the rules are. With the background checks, another side to that is that employee fraud. I don't know how these people do it, but there's people out there that are holding 4 or 5 jobs. interview, get the job. Maybe they're not doing very well. They're doing a lot of training, a lot of learning. They're collecting a paycheck, right? But they've got 4 or 5 jobs out there, and they're collecting paychecks. And then once they finally get fired from one, they move on to another, and they just continuously do this, right? So doing those background checks, fully involved, right? Get those 7, 8 categories. Make sure we're looking at everything. Go through the entire onboarding process with them. We want to make sure that those are there. It's just becoming a lot more prevalent. So again, document those controls that you see and how it aligns with what you're looking for and what your policy is. Identity and access management. Again, there's those access controls, unique ID, passwords in place, MFA, hoping that we align with what our passwords and what our access controls are, making sure that whoever's requesting the access isn't there's this separation there, right? That's really starts speaking to the maturity of that company. Employee onboarding and access are those first steps. And if we don't do that properly, who knows what kind of access these people are going to have, these employees are going to have to your customer data, to your employee data, to your system. So making sure those controls are in place on both sides is really the first couple controls, first couple objectives in a SOC report will cover that, and just making sure they're in place.
Quick question.
Yes.
As you kind of talked about employees having more roles here, I got a kind of interesting question for you. A little bit of a different topic, but our organization currently handles vendor management in an ad hoc manner, and we are looking to assign this role to someone internally as a permanent responsibility. Which job roles do you typically see owning this responsibility, and what traits or skills do you look for in an individual who will manage this program?
Yeah, I mean, unfortunately, I see it in security, or somebody with a security background, because as we go through this, these are the crux of a security program. The things that we're going through here on the little bit of a deeper dive, understanding the proper controls, how to read an audit report, a SOC report, understand vulnerabilities in a pen test. I really feel that security heads it up, and then the department head or operations would have a role as well. Finance approves it, right? Make sure that it's budgeted and there's a business case for it. But I think doing this part of the review, right, would fall down to there has to be some kind of security involvement in it. But the business does have a process in place to request new vendors, approved by business. That would be your department head, somebody maybe in the executive side, and then approved from a financial standpoint. So we're not just going ahead and doing a review for something that they're never going to buy or get anyway.
Perfect. Thank you for
Hope that answered it. So again, change management. A lot of these, do they have an SDLC, right? Do they have a program where changes are being requested, submitted, they're being tested, there's a security impact to it, they're being approved. And then what's the communication of those changes, right? If it's a change in, say it's a cloud platform that's going to impact you as the customer, as the user, it's going to affect your employees or your customers. How do we know, right? And those SOC reports has a whole section on communication and how we're being notified of things such as changes. So it's a nice control to look at to make sure that we're going to be notified properly if there's a change within the platform, within the system. Sometimes it's just, hey, when you log on, there's going to be a banner that tells you about the changes that were made. Maybe there's a weekly change, or when updates are coming, there's an email that comes out. So knowing what to expect, for that platform, for that vendor, for that supplier is very helpful. So a lot more on this list, but backup and recovery, again, another vital control process. If you're storing data and you're going to need access to that data, who's responsible for backup and recovery of that data? Right? Is it your instance? Is it their instance? If it's their instance, are they backing it up? How often, right? It comes back down to that RPO, right? What's that recovery point, right? Am I going to lose up to 24 hours of data, up to a week of data, a month of data? In today's day and age, it's usually within 24 hours. But I want to see that. I want to be able to document that. And I want to show that I've done my due diligence and I'm helping to protect the organization. And we know if there's a risk here, right? If it's 7 days, if it's 30 days, there's something we should do on our side. SOC reports also have user entity controls. So those are controls that you, the business unit, are responsible for. So it may say in there that you're required to have backup and recover your own data, your own instance. So nice to know what those are and things that the business isn't looking at when they're picking a particular vendor, right? That's where we really help out and protect the business. And then recovery, right? It's one thing to back it up. Can it be recovered, right? Are those backups validated as being successful? Does the staff know how to recover it? Whether it's a single file, profile, or a full recovery of the full database, right? They should be testing those and on a specific cadence, right? Your policy may say annually. Well, they should be testing it at least annually then. Your policy may say every 6 months. You can ask for every 6 months, right? And depending on the amount you're paying them, probably, they may listen. They may push back, but it's always worth a listen. Worth asking the question and see if they listen. Encryption, again, is the data at rest encrypted? Data in transit encrypted? What are they using from a TLS standpoint? You can do some public scans on that. SSL Labs is one that I use, and I'll put the URL in there, and I'll see where they sit from a encryption standpoint, where their certificates lie. So again, another public thing that you can do on your own, but they should be putting that in their SOC report as well. And speaking about how they encrypt data, includes backup data, right? Are the backups encrypted? That's a big part of every single SOC audit I go through, is making sure that our backups are encrypted. And then offsites. So we have companies still that are using tape backups for offsites. It's rare, but it still exists. They need to be encrypted, right? We can't be sending them offsite not encrypted, or storing them somewhere not encrypted, right? If we're saying we're looking for encryption, we got to encrypt across the board. Secure file transfer, right? SFTP. Do they have something? We're a share file company. We use share file to make sure we, upload anything that we want to keep secure into that platform, right? We test that platform. We make sure that we do our full diligence on them, right? But do they have something in place so that we know that, hey, we shouldn't be emailing these files back and forth, especially if they don't have encryption. But is there a secure way of transferring these files, right? Notify the business, notify the users. Hey, we shouldn't be sharing these things over email. Make sure that we're using their secure file transfer that they have in place. And again, all ways that we can support the business and do things as secure as humanly possible. Physical controls, right? A lot of this, you're going to learn whether they're a remote company, if they have an office, how many offices they might have, how they govern that access, right? Do they have badge access? Is there keyed access? Do they have visitor controls, restricted areas in terms of the data center, right? If they have a data center, is that access restricted to certain people? What kind of controls are there? Is there a man trap? Cameras, a lot of things from security, from a physical standpoint that you can look at, and depending on what part of the country they're in, right? Business continuity plays a role in this as well. So if that office closed, how does that impact their operations? If that office closed, do they have an alternate office? Do they have a backup, location to go to so that their business can keep going, right? Their business resiliency impacts your business resiliency. So we really care about what they have. Data retention and disposal. Again, if you're giving them your data, what's the retention policy, right? A lot of it's tied to contracts. So if you have something in contract that says 30 days after termination, you return your data, return our data to us. 30 days, you destroy the data. Do they have that ability, right? Is it in the contract? Do they have a policy on it? And if they're disposing it, how are they disposing of it? End of life hardware. Are they disposing of that hardware, right? What happens with it? What happens with that data that's on that hard drive? Are they storing data on their local devices, right? Or is it only in a cloud environment? So understanding where that data lives, how it can get returned to you, if they even have that capability. All right, last hole we're digging, I promise. So another biggie when you go through these is risk management. That's what we're doing right now, right? We talked about enterprise risk management, and are they operating, actively doing risk management? Policy procedure is great. What else do they have to identify risk, right? Are they doing the risk assessments that we talk about? If they are doing a risk assessment, which they should be, how are those getting communicated to the executive leadership, right? Is it there that risk committee? Is that steering committee where we're talking about the risks that were identified in the most recent risk assessment? How else can we identify risk? Identify risk is having a conversation, talking to a coworker. Hey, did you know about this? Or, hey, I was able to access this. Are you able to access this? Yeah, I am, but we shouldn't, right? Well, who else? So if we can, who else can access it, right? Where do we identify that risk? What do we do with that risk? Does it make it all the way to the top? Right? Risk management is a big piece of any security program, and something that we're looking for when we're doing our diligence. And again, any company who's doing diligence on you, clearly they care about risk management. And if you're doing diligence on them, they need to care about risk management as well. Incident response. So again, another one that if something happens, right, we always say not if, but when. Do you have a plan in place? Have you tested it? Do you have escalation points, right? That test helps us identify that they have identified those escalation points. They've tested it and it's passed, or they have lessons learned. So asking for that test is helpful. Seeing it within a SOC report. Again, if they've tested, that's great. You can follow up and ask for a copy of that test. And if something happens, what's the notification look like? That's going to be in their SOC report. That's probably going to be in their privacy policy. That's going to be in a DPA, and it should be in a contract. So if something happens, how are you going to know about it? What's the timeline? Right? Standard for me is 72 hours. I think GDPR even moved it to 96 hours. But I've got a lot of customers that ask us for 24 hours. And in some cases, depending on the vendor, depending on the key customer part of it, we'll oblige. Sometimes we won't. 72 hours is our standard, especially if you have 1,000 companies. You got to notify 1,000 different companies. Can you do all that in 24 hours? It can be tough. So looking for that process to be in place as well. Vendor management, again, they should have one. We have one clearly because we're talking about one. So if you're going to them, you should be able to know what to ask them for. And it's aligned with everything that we're doing right here. They should be identifying the critical vendors. They should be assessing their critical vendors, and they should be doing it at least annually, if not a little bit more frequently. And work with the business too. Same thing. Hey, are they meeting your expectations? Right? Is the price does it keep going up? Right? That's part of it too. You can assist the business in that standpoint. I know we talked to the question earlier that it lives with security, right? Don't keep it at your level. Ask the business, hey, are they still meeting your needs? Right? They can play a role in that as well. And we can always look for alternatives if it's not. And security can certainly help with that because we'll go assess the next one to make sure that they're going to be up to snuff. So vulnerability scanning, we talked about this a little bit. Again, it should be in the SOC 2 report. You can see that they're doing it. You can see that it's continuous. You can see how often, some just do quarterly scans, some scan once a year. Really, what's your policy and what kind of data are they processing? How many users do they have? Endpoints? Are they remote? Are they in-house? A lot of people do the answers you'll see in a SOC report are going to be around doing the annual pen tests that we talked about before. So we do this annually. Same thing. If they're doing it, you're right. You can ask for it. If they have findings, not the worst thing, but how do you remediate? Can you show screenshots that they've been remediated? Do you have a rescan? A retest afterwards? Ask for that. And then we talked about earlier the public facing. Those companies that you can go see what the public facing scans look like, what the results are, what the issues are. You're able to publicly get that. So it's a really great tool to use. So here's what an assess that, and again, this report unfortunately doesn't show up great in a PowerPoint. It looks a lot better when you're actually using it. It's in a PDF format. But this is, an idea of what it looks like. And I've redacted a lot of this and put Compass on here. But this is a lot of what it looks like when we do a assessment of a vendor. So again, I've asked the questions about, does the vendor have access to sensitive information? Company or employee information? How quickly does the vendor need to recover the service? and can you find a replacement, right? That's going to build up what our risk level to this vendor is. So understanding how critical they are to your service delivery will usually get called out in this. The documents that we reviewed as a part of it, we've got checkboxes here for everything that we've looked at. This was more of a self due diligence, right? So we didn't send them a questionnaire. Reviewed their PCI, their SOC 2. They have an ISO certification, private privacy policy. We were able to review the contract, right? Work with legal, work with sales, be part of that review. Most of these contracts and MSAs have a SECs, security standard, security clauses in there. Review those, right? Do they meet up with what you have? You should have an agreement and a DPA that has security clauses in it, security measures in it that you have, so that you can meet their standards. So you should be reviewing all of these. Did they sign your NDA as you were negotiating and talking about it, right? All things that we can capture here. The SOC report we just reviewed. Again, this has become the industry standard. So when we do a review, you'll see same thing. We put the what we reviewed, the opinion, the observation period, and this will build, right? So the next year that we do this, we can add year 2 onto here, and we can, see that there's no gap there. Make sure all these controls are the same. Nothing has changed. Not really recreating the wheel every time we have to do it, but we are properly doing it. We mentioned the user entity controls. So here's what they have, and that we have controls in place locally to adhere to those. So again, just an idea of what this looks like when we actually operate and do one of these. So at the end here, again, a lot of these things that I've mentioned ad nauseum, protect the organization, right? This is part of enterprise risk management. Findings, this report, if there's findings on it, even if there's not findings on it, we want to document this and make sure we're sharing it, and people understand what's approved, what's not, what's a high risk vendor, what's a critical vendor. Go through that entire process, operate it. Again, the goal is to protect the organization. Know who your critical vendors are, right? That's part of it. A huge part of it. A huge part of what we just went through today is you got to know who they are. Engage the business units. Look at your BIA. Make sure those BIAs are getting done annually as well, or at least reviewed annually. Much more of a manual process for the smaller companies, as we talked about. Doing our self due diligence. There's ways out there. The questionnaire is not the only way. See what you can figure out on your own if you're not going to go through the questionnaire process, and document all of it. Just like that report I just showed you. Again, that's one way of doing it. Everybody has their own ways of doing it. You may have a third-party management tool that's helping you, but make sure you document it. Whether it's the way I just showed you, or if you have another way. Again, no wrong answers. As long as you're doing it and documenting it and reporting it, then you're doing the right thing. And again, enterprise risk management, that's where we started. That's where we're going to finish, right? That's a part of it. All of this reports up. So, keep falling in line with that. And again, keep that organization, keep those risks, keep those findings top of mind, and report it all the way up. And with that, I appreciate the questions throughout. Taking a drink of water certainly helps when you're talking for an hour. So thank you for the questions. And if you have any more, I'm all ears.
I have a couple for you, actually. The first one here is, do you see the need to assess the financial stability of a prospective vendor? If they are not viable, this can impact their ability to execute a security program. Great question.
Yeah, absolutely. Great question. And something that probably should have been mentioned in here. Absolutely. Sometimes they won't let you look at their financials. Certainly worth asking for. But yes, anything you can figure out from a public standpoint is helpful. A lot of times that's where getting sales and I guess having a different role, again, goes back again to that question that somebody asked earlier, who should own this? And again, I still say that we are the owners, but having buy-in and participation from other business units, operations, CFO, accounting, financial, sales, can really help us get that information to have that another piece to make sure that they are a viable company for us and that they're going to be here for the long haul, because we are, right? So we want to make sure they are. So absolutely, and great question, and something I did omit.
Another good question here, and something I know I've dealt with personally as I seek out, even just marketing vendors from my role at Compass. But how would you go about conducting research on new vendors? It can feel overwhelming at times figuring out where to start when searching for new vendors. For example, what search mediums to use, what criteria or rating platforms to use to compare vendors who all claim to be the most secure.
Great question, right? Because I mentioned earlier, it's a marketing tool. So we're not going to show what we're doing bad. We may be specific but vague, right? Specific when it benefits us and vague when it benefits us. And again, it's a great question. I say multiple mediums. Again, I hate to, we are product agnostic, but Gartner. And again, sometimes I don't even know what to trust, truthfully, because I don't know who's paying what to get things to show up a certain way. Google search, we know, is the same way, right? You can pay a third party to help your Google search yourself show up higher up in a Google search. So again, reviewing with the business itself, always a great way. Their documentation should support what they say they're doing. You should be able to look at pen test reports that are done by a third party. The objectivity of a third party doing these things is huge, right? It's one thing to say we're doing an internal assessment, we're doing scans internally, but that third party review, that third party attestation, that third party pen test report, that SOC report, to validate what they say they're doing is probably the best way to understand whether what's being done. That public profile, using whether BitSight, Security Scorecard, Black Kite, to get a look at the public facing portal IPs to see what vulnerabilities show up there, what issues they have, certainly helps. So I'd say those two things are the biggest for me. The Google search is helpful if you can get to the right review. Not the end all be all though, but I would say that third party attestation reports is really to support what they say they're doing is the best way.
Another question that ties into the question before last: what can you do if you have an operationally critical vendor that won't provide financials for our due diligence review? The vendor is not public yet.
Yeah, that's a business that becomes a decision, right? So between everything that you've been able to get, right? So working with what you do have, and then working with the business. And if, trust is a big thing, right? Especially when you're considering them a critical vendor, critical supplier, critical to your operations. How comfortable you are, do you trust them? Are there any alternatives? I mentioned earlier, I review alternatives with a lot of these so that if somebody does go belly up or isn't up to our standards and we find it out halfway through, that we're halfway there on who we might use. So with that situation, I engage the business and we work to make a decision together. And we decide whether this is the only vendor we can do this with, or do we have any, are we in a position of power that if they won't give this, then we're not willing to work with them. So tough spot though, honestly, tough spot. And that's where the relationship with the entire business works. Again, from a security standpoint, having that monthly meeting, having that risk committee meeting, having that steering committee meeting, having these conversations, having a relationship to where you can have these conversations, and doing what's best for the business. Again, everything you guys have talked about is in line with protecting the organization, right? And enterprise risk management. So having that conversation all the way up to the top and making a unified decision is what works in that case.